Hi there. Pretty much everybody agrees that humanity is facing great problems. There's a lot of different opinions about what these problems are, and in my opinion, it can be summarized as three great problems, which I would like to call the problem of environment, the problem of borders, and the problem of Ditnac. With environment, well, of course there is global warming and pollution in general, but at the core of it, we have the risk of an extinction level event. Humanity might cause one, and even if we don't, we might not be powerful enough to stop one if one happens without us triggering it. So we really need to be better at handling our environment and start by stop destroying it. As for borders, the main thing here is that solutions are not becoming globalized nearly as fast as problems are. We have great problems with global inequality, lack of freedom of speech, lack of freedom of movement, lack of social security, and so on. I'm not proposing that we should just abolish the idea of the national state, but it is gradually becoming obsolete, and we gradually need to find other ways to solve problem as well. As for the thing I call Ditnac, this is what people usually call by labels such as extremism, narrow-mindedness, fundamentalism, radicalism, and so on. I am not really fond of those names for various reasons. I'm going to start by explaining what I mean by Ditnac, and then explain why I'm not so fond of those other more popular names. Well, Ditnac has 6 letters and each stand for one concept. It is dichotomism, identitism, termism, narrativism, authoritism, and categorism. If you have seen my previous videos, you have heard of 4 of these concepts before, but I'm going to summarize all 6 concepts. And 6 concepts in a row is a bit much, so let's break it up in 2 parts. First we have dit, which is about absolutes, and then we have nac, which is about hierarchies. So, first we have dichotomism, identitism, and termism. Dichotomism is often known as dichotomous thinking, binary thinking, black and white thinking, or the tyranny of the discontinuous mind. It is a matter of not only dividing everything in pairs of opposites, but getting stuck in these pairs. The process of creating opposites, that's a really good process. That's how you make new concepts. Dichotomization, it's not a bad thing at all, but when you get stuck in it, when you limit your reality to one set of opposites or another, when you don't understand that this is merely a tool that your brain is using, when you think it's a thing in itself, then you do have a problem. Dichotomism is also fueling us versus them mentality and similar problems. It's a core of much problems, and each of these concepts are a core of much problems. They're pretty much intertwined with each other. The other problem, speaking of black and white thinking and us versus them, we have identitism. This is not merely a matter of having an identity and letting it be important to you. No, when it becomes identitism, that's when you let the universe revolve around your identity, and you might not even realize it. You think that's just the way things are, but that's not really the case. The universe does not revolve around you personally, and no, it does not revolve around whatever social group you identify with either. And finally, in the first trinary, we have termism. This is getting stuck in words and definitions. You fail to realize, or at least utilize, the distinction between terms, concepts, and phenomena. There's a lot of things to study in physical reality, in mental realities, and in social realities. The realities we have outside of us, inside of us, and between us. When we try to study these things, our mind makes up concepts for them, and then we assign words and other terms to these concepts. When we don't realize this distinction, we do have a problem. Termism, it can be people actually believing that the world around them works in a certain way because that is how they have defined the word, and that's not how it works. That's a kind of magical thinking that is not productive. We must realize that terms are fluid and they are whatever we make of them. We need to avoid talking past each other, and we need to avoid talking past ourselves. So this is the first set of three, the one of absolutes, the dit in Ditnac. Moving on to the second part, nac, the one about hierarchies. We have first of all narrativism. It's a matter of not merely using storytelling narratives, but getting stuck in them and reducing people and the world to them. It's completely fine to make yourself a story about yourself and about the world and so on. Much of human thought relies on narratives, and this is totally fine. But you do get a problem when you don't realize that just like you or your group or your struggle or whatever is the protagonist of your own story, then everybody else are the protagonists of their own stories as well. When you reduce other people to being props or narrative tools, and when you disregard facts that don't fit into your narrative, you have a huge problem. By the way, narrativism applied to fiction is totally fine. Only real human beings have real human rights. And if you want to treat a fictional person as merely a narrative tool, that's totally fine. But please don't do that to actual human beings who actually have their own minds rather than being a figment of your own imagination. And then we have authorityism, where I am right because I am right. at the core of it. I don't make a distinction between openly appealing to your own personal authority on one hand, and to, on the other hand, appeal to some great thinker or God or whatever. Because when you appeal to the authority of an external source, it is still your authority in choosing what authority should be considered valid and how to interpret it. Interpretation. When you claim that you don't even have an opinion, you're merely challenging the one true perspective of the creator of the universe. You may pretend to yourself and others that you're being really humble, that you're not taking any position of authority at all, but that's not really the case. On the contrary, you are assuming to have the authority of God. You're assuming to have the authority of the creator of the universe, and that's a big problem, especially for people who don't even agree with your idea of the universe having a creator at all in the first place, much less your personal or scriptural or whatever interpretation. And I'm not making any distinction between religion and ideology here, and using science as an authority in itself rather than a method for finding and handling relevant facts. That can become the same thing. And it's entirely unscientific. Real science doesn't work that way. And finally, we have categorism, which I define as prejudice, bigotry, and discrimination based on the categorization of human beings. Categorism has three aspects. First of all, we have the facets, how categorism is done. As the archetype facets, we have prejudice, bigotry, and discrimination. And then we have all kinds of specific facets, which are expressions of these three archetypes. We have demonization, invisibilization, marginalization, exploitation, violence. The list goes on forever. In my first master thesis, I listed 30 different facets. And I also listed 30 different foci. A focus of categorism, it is how the categorism is directed. What specific categorization you base it on, even if the categorization in itself is totally valid. When you base your categorism on ideas about skin color, then it's called racism. When you base it on an idea of gender, it's called sexism. And so on. Racism, sexism, and homophobia are the most famous ones. But we also have a lot of other foci of categorism. The list of 30 foci available in my master thesis, it's also available at www.categorism.com. And finally, we have abstractions of categorism, which is when categorization itself become categorism, when you're lumping people together in a bigoted way or whatever. I only listed 10 abstractions, also available on the site. So, we have 3 parts about thinking in absolutes, and we have 3 parts about thinking in hierarchies. In both cases, in destructive ways. Of course, you can use absolutes and hierarchies as cognitive and social tools, but it easily becomes oppressive or otherwise destructive. And this is something we really need to watch out for. The reason for why I prefer to call the whole thing Ditnac is because it pinpoints these 6 reasonably specific phenomena. It points out what the problem is. Now, let's compare these to more common words, such as extremism, for starters. What does it mean that something is extreme? Well, it means that it's far from the mainstream. But what if the mainstream is wrong? Things that were once extreme are mainstream today, and things that are mainstream today will be extreme in the future. So extremism is not a really useful label. It doesn't really pinpoint whether it's a good or a bad thing. Same thing with the word radicalism. And the word fundamentalism and fanaticism, they have the same problem, and they also have an additional problem by giving us the idea that if a religious person or a person with an ideology such as liberalism or socialism or feminism or communism or whatever, the words fundamentalism and fanaticism gives the idea that if the person with the religion or ideology is Ditnac, then this person is more real and more genuine than a person who is not Ditnac. And that is simply not the case. We have much more reason to respect people for their beliefs when they are having their beliefs in a nuanced, thoughtful way, rather than going Ditnac on us. We should not respect Ditnac. We should respect people's beliefs in various ways. And again, with the distinction between physical reality outside of us, mental realities inside of us, and social realities between us. When it comes to mental realities, the objective truth is that whatever a person experiences is what that person experiences. Subjectivity is objective, and as long as you realize that this is about a person's mind, this is not a bad thing. Do indulge in your own emotions and your own internal world. Just don't get stuck in it. You should respect yourself and you should respect others. Just don't get lost in that. Just because something is true in a person's mind and might help this person in all kinds of ways, it doesn't mean that it should be imposed on social reality for other people, and it does not mean that it has anything to say about physical reality. If I believe I can fly, this may be a really valid metaphor for something, but it does not mean that it's a good idea to jump out of a window. Just put it on the right level. In the end, what matters is not what religion or ideology you have or don't have. What matters is how you have it. Please use critical thinking. Try to see things from different perspectives and don't be Ditnac. And that's all I have to say for now. Live long and prosper.